Hello, welcome to chapter 4 of the Chronicles of Narnia, the Magicians Nephew, the first book in the Chronicles of Narnia series, and we're starting again at chapter 4, which is called The Bell and the Hammer. There was no doubt about the magic this time. Down and down they rushed, first through darkness and then through a mass of vague, whirling shapes which might have been almost anything. It grew lighter, then suddenly they felt that they were standing on something solid. A moment later, everything came into focus, and they were able to look about them. "What a strange place," said Diggory. "I don't like it," said Polly, with something like a shudder. What they noticed first was the light. It wasn't like sunlight, and it wasn't like electric light, or lamps, or candles, or any other light they'd ever seen. It was a dull, rather red light, and not at all cheerful. It was steady, and it did not flicker. They were standing on a flat paved surface, and buildings rose all around them. There was no roof overhead. They were in some sort of courtyard. The sky was extraordinarily dark, a blue that was almost black. When you had seen that sky, you wondered that there should be any light at all. "It's very funny weather here," said Diggory. "I wonder if we've arrived just in time for a thunderstorm or an eclipse." "I don't like it," said Polly. Both of them, without quite knowing why, were talking in whispers. And though there was no reason why they should go on holding hands after their jump, they didn't let go. The walls rose very high around them in the courtyard, and they had many great windows in them, windows without glass, through which you saw nothing but black darkness. Lower down there were great pillared arches, yawning blackly, like the mouths of railway tunnels. It was rather cold. The stone of which everything was built seemed to be red, but that was only because of the curious light. It was obviously very old. Many of the flat stones that had paved the courtyard had cracks across them. None of them fitted closely together, and all of the sharp corners were worn off. One of the arched doorways was half filled with rubble. The two children kept on turning round and round to look at the different sides of the courtyard. One reason was that they're afraid of somebody, or something, looking out of those windows at them when their backs were turned. "Do you think anyone lives here?" said Diggory at last, still in a whisper. "No," said Polly. "It's all in ruins. We haven't heard a sound since we came." "Let's stand and listen for a bit," suggested Diggory. They stood and listened, but all they could hear was the thump-thump of their own hearts. This place was at least as quiet as the wood between the worlds, but it was a different kind of quietness. The silence of the wood had been rich and warm. You could almost hear the trees growing, and full of life, but this was dead and cold, empty silence. You couldn't imagine anything growing in it at all. "Let's go home," said Polly. "But we haven't seen anything yet," said Diggory. "Now we're here, we simply must look around." "I'm sure there's nothing interesting at all here." "There's not much point in finding a magic ring that lets you into other worlds if you're afraid to look at them once you get there." "Who's talking about being afraid?" said Polly, letting go of Diggory's hand. "I only thought you didn't seem very keen on this place." "Well, I'll go anywhere you go." "We can get away the moment we want to," said Diggory. "Let's take off our green rings and put them in our right-hand pockets. All we've got to do is remember that our yellows are in our left-hand pockets. You keep your hand as near as that pocket as you like, but don't put it in, or you'll touch your yellow and vanish." They did this and went quietly up to one of the big arched doorways, which led into the inside of a building. And when they stood on the threshold and could look in, they saw it was not so dark inside as they had first thought. It led into a vast, shadowy hall, which appeared to be empty. But on the far side, there was a row of pillars with arches between them, and through those arches there streamed in some more of that same tired-looking light. They crossed the hall, walking carefully for fear of holes in the floor or of anything lying about that they might trip over. It seemed a long walk. When they had reached the other side, they came through the arches and found themselves in another courtyard. "That doesn't look very safe," said Polly, pointing at a place where the wall bulged over and looked as if it was ready to fall into the courtyard. In one place, a pillar was missing between the two arches, and the bit that came down to where the top of the pillar ought to have hung, there was nothing to support it. Clearly, the place had been deserted for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. "If it's lasted till now, I suppose it will last a bit longer, but we must be very quiet. You know, a noise brings things down sometimes, like an avalanche in the Alps." They went out of the courtyard into another doorway, and up a great flight of stairs, and through vast rooms that opened out of one another until you were dizzy with the mere size of the place. Now, every now and then, they thought they were going to get into the open and see what sort of country lay around the enormous place, but each time they got into another courtyard. They must have been magnificent places when people were still living there. In one of them had been a great fountain. A great stone monster with widespread wings stood with its mouth open, and you could see a bit of piping coming out of its mouth, of which water used to pour. Under it was a wide stone basin to hold the water, but it was dry as a bone. In other places, where the dry sticks, some sort of climbing plants had wound themselves around the pillars and helped to pull some of them down, but it had died a long time ago. There were no ants or spiders or any other living thing that you would expect to see in a ruin. Where the dry earth showed between the broken flagstone, there was no grass or moss. It was all so dreary and all so much the same that even Diggory was thinking that they better had put on their yellow rings and get back to the warm green living forest of the in-between place. When they came to two huge doors of some metal that might possibly be gold, one stood a little ajar, and so of course they went to look in. Both startled back and drew a long breath, for in here was something worth seeing. For a second, they thought the room was full of people. Hundreds of people, all seated and all perfectly still. Polly and Diggory, as you may guess, stood perfectly still themselves for a good long time looking in. But presently they decided that what they were looking at could not be real people. There was no movement, and there was no sound of breath among them. They were all like the most perfect waxworks you ever saw. This time, Polly took the lead. There was something in the room which interested her more than Diggory. All of the figures were wearing magnificent clothes. If you were interested in clothes at all, you could hardly help going in to see them closer. And the blaze of their colours made this room not exactly cheerful, but at any rate rich and majestic after all the dust and emptiness of the others. It had more windows too, and it was a good deal lighter. I can hardly describe the clothes. The figures were all robed and had crowns on their heads. Their robes were of crimson and silvery grey, and of deep purple and vivid green. There were patterns and pictures of flowers and strange beasts in needlework all over them. Precious stones of astonishing size and brightness stared from their crowns and hung in chains round their necks and peeped out from all the places it was fastened. "Why haven't these clothes rotted away?" asked Polly. "Magic," whispered Diggory. "Can you feel it? I bet this whole room is just stiff with enchantments. I could feel it the moment we walked in." "Any one of these dresses would have cost hundreds of pounds," said Polly. But Diggory was more interested in the faces, and indeed, these were well worth looking at. The people sat in their stone chairs on each side of the room, and the floor was left free down the middle. You could walk down and look at the faces in turn. They were nice people, I think, said Diggory. Polly nodded. All the faces they could see were certainly nice. Both the men and the women looked kind and wise, and they seemed to come of a handsome race. But after the children had gone a few steps down the room, they came to faces that seemed different. They were very solemn faces. You felt that you would have to mind your P's and Q's if you ever met living people who looked like that. When they'd gone a little further, they found themselves among faces they didn't like. This was about the middle of the room. The faces here looked very strong and proud and happy, but they also looked cruel. A little further on and they looked crueler. Further again, they were still cruel, but they no longer looked happy. They were despairing faces, as if the people they belonged to had done dreadful things and were also suffered dreadful things. The last figure of all was the most interesting. A woman, even more richly dressed than the others, very tall, but every figure in that room was taller than the people of our world. But she had a lot of fierceness and pride that took your breath away. Yet she was beautiful too. Years afterwards, when he was an old man, Diggory said he had never in his life known a woman so beautiful. It is only fair to add that Polly always said she couldn't see anything specially beautiful about her. This woman, as I said, was the last. But there were plenty of empty chairs beyond her, as if the room had been intended for a much larger collection of images. I do wish we know the story that's behind all of this, said Diggory. Let's go back and look at the table of that sort of thing in the middle of the room. The thing in the middle of the room was not exactly a table. It was a square pillar about 4 foot high, and on it there rose a little golden arch from which there lay a golden bell, and besides this lay a little golden hammer to hit the bell with. I wonder, said Diggory. There seems to be something down here. Written down here, said Polly, stooping down and looking at the side of the pillar. By gum, there is, said Diggory. But of course, we shan't be able to read it. Shan't we? I'm not so sure, said Polly. They both looked at it hard, as you might have expected. The letters cut into the stone were strange. But now a great wonder happened, for as they looked, though the shape of the strange letters never altered, they found that they could understand them. If only Diggory had remembered what he had said to himself a few minutes ago, that this was an enchanted room, he might have guessed that the enchantment was beginning to work. But he was too wild with curiosity to think about that. He was longing more and more to know what was written on the pillar. And very soon, they both knew. What it said was something like this. At least, this is in the sense of it through the poetry when you read it. There was better. It said this. Make your choice, adventurous stranger. Strike the bell and bide the danger, or wander till it drives you mad. What would follow if you had? No fear, said Polly. We don't want any danger. Oh, but don't you see it's no good, said Diggory. We can't get out of it now. We will always be wondering what would have happened if we had struck the bell. I'm going to be driven mad if I always think of that, no fear. Don't be silly, said Polly, as if anyone would. What does it matter what would have happened? I expect anyone who's come as far as this is bound to go on wondering till it sends them dotty. That's the magic of it, you see. I can already feel it beginning to work on me. Well, I don't, said Polly crossly, and I don't believe you do either. You're just putting it on. That's all you know, said Diggory. It's because you're a girl. Girls never want to know anything about anything, and they just want to know gossip about people getting engaged. You looked exactly like your uncle when you said that, said Polly. Why can't you keep to the point, said Diggory. That's what we're talking about. How exactly like a man, said Polly in a very grown-up voice. But she added hastily in her real voice, and don't say just 'cause I'm a woman, or you'll be a beastly copycat. Oh, I should never dream of calling a kid like you a woman, said Diggory loftily. Oh, I'm a kid, am I? Said Polly, who was now in a real rage. Well, you needn't bother by having a kid like me with you any longer. I'm off. I've had enough of this place, and I've had enough of you, you beastly, stuck-up, obstinate pig. None of that, said Diggory, in a voice even nastier than he meant it to be, for he saw Polly's hand was moving to her pocket to get hold of her yellow ring. I can't excuse what he did next by saying that he was very sorry for it afterwards. But Polly's hand reached in her pocket, grabbed her wrist, leaning back against his back with her chest, then keeping her other arm out the way with his elbow. He leaned forward, picked up the hanger, and struck the golden bell, a light, smart tap. And then he let her go, as they fell apart, staring at each other and breathing hard. Polly was just beginning to cry, not with fear, and not even because he had hurt her wrist quite badly, but with furious anger. Within 2 seconds, however, they had something to think about that drove their own quarrels right out of their minds. As soon as the bell struck, it gave out a note, a sweet note you might have expected, but not very loud. But instead of dying away again, it went on, and it grew louder. And before a minute passed, it was twice as loud as it had been to begin with. It was so loud that if the children tried to speak, they would not have heard one another. Very soon it was so loud that they couldn't hear another even by shouting. And still it grew, all on one note, a continuous sweet sound, though the sweetness had something horrible about it, till the air in that room was a great throbbing with it, and they could feel the stone floor trembling under their feet. Then at last it began to be mixed with another sound, a vague, disastrous noise, which sounded like the roar of a distant train, and then like the crashing of a falling tree. They heard something, like great weights falling. Finally, with a sudden rush and thunder, and a shake that nearly flung them off their feet, nearly a quarter of the roof at one end of the room fell in. Great blocks of masonry fell all around them, and the walls rocked. The noise of the bell stopped, and the great cloud of dust cleared away, and everything became quiet again. It was never found out whether the fall of the roof was due to the magic, or whether the unbearably loud sound from the bell had just happened to strike a note which was more than those crumbling walls could stand. There, I hope you're satisfied now, panted Polly. Well, it's all over anyway, said Diggory, and they both thought it was, but they had never been more mistaken in their lives. And that's the end of chapter 4. We'll have chapter 5 tomorrow.